what is to be done. Joseph experienced this. We experience this. I think the college experience is largely summarized by uncertainty, right? What am I going to major in? What am I going to do professionally? Am I going to seek advanced learning? Am I going to get a doctorate or a master's degree? Where am I going to go? How am I going to prepare? How am I going to prepare for it? How am I going to pay for it? Is it weird to ask out my TA on a date? You know, these like super important questions. How much time should we spend in social activities versus studying? And I'll be honest, Crystal and I took a very different approach to this. So you should probably ask her opinion, not mine, on how you find that balance. And I don't pretend to have all of the answers. But I do want to share with you 3 stories that illustrate lessons that I have learned and strategies that I have tried to build to help to cope with that. So those 3 strategies are, right, tell them what you're going to tell them and tell them what you told them, is find rest in the Lord, plan by principles, and lean in and be patient. So the first, rest in the Lord. February 23rd, 2009 was a day that I forgot how to walk. Dr. Porter mentioned this briefly. So I was in my first year of medical school. We were 1 week away from block exams. I was a few weeks away from my 25th birthday, and I woke up with a splitting headache. And that wasn't unusual because I spent a lot of time studying, like 16-hour days, so bad posture, hunched over books with small text. So I was not a stranger to headaches, but this one was different. I went into the bathroom to take some Tylenol, and I had such visual disturbance that I hadn't realized at this point that I slammed into the door frame, and I couldn't even read the word Tylenol on the bottle. I just took a handful, swallowed it down. As I looked up in the mirror, I realized that everything was slanted. And because I was standing on the side of my foot rather than the bottom of my foot. And it took incredible effort to straighten that back out. It was really, really weird. And as I did so, it felt like somebody snuck up behind me and poured a vessel of warm oil over the top of my head. But that oil never crossed midline. It always stayed on the left side. As that sensation went from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet, I was losing all strength and all sensation. And I half stumbled, I half fell out into the room, and I called my roommate, who was a third-year med student at the time, and I said, "John, I'm having a stroke." He bounded in laughing because one secret about medical students is we are all hypochondriacs. You spend all day studying disease, and so suddenly every headache must be meningitis. And he was sure that this was the case. He realized very quickly that was not, called 911, and as we were waiting for the paramedics to arrive, I had him call my father. I needed to hear his voice. I just needed some comfort and stability. And while my father was on the phone, I asked John, who was also a Melchizedek priesthood holder, to give me a blessing. I got real oil this time. And as he laid his hands on my head, and he gave me a blessing, I don't remember what he said. I know how it started. Dustin Michael Freckleton by the power of the Melchizedek priesthood. And the only words that I remember was that I was promised that I would fully recover with no residual effect. And just as real as that feeling of oil running down my head when I had the stroke was the feeling and the somatic response as the Spirit testified to me that that promise came from the Lord. I was terrified up until that moment. I had spent the better years of my life in a library. I had been locked overnight in the library because I missed closing time, and they just locked up and left. I hadn't done all that for this. But in that moment, all that fear, all that anxiety went away. And I knew that everything was going to be okay. Now, I didn't know all the details. I didn't know how long rehab and recovery was going to be. I didn't know how painful the process was going to be. I didn't know what would happen in my medical training. But I knew that everything was going to be okay. And that was transformative, both professionally, as upon graduation it led me to a different path in healthcare, but also in spiritual learning. So what did I learn? I learned the importance of entering into the rest of the Lord. Anyone can survive uncertainty. We have no choice in that. But to thrive in uncertainty first requires entering into the Lord's rest. And I used to think that entering into the Lord's rest meant ascending these pearly steps and walking through the gates and curling up on a celestial armchair and being in, the Lord's living room. And now I was in the rest of the Lord. But I realized that there's a different, perhaps more important definition of that. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt so afraid, where everything seemed to be crashing down around you and was unmanageable? And in that moment, you thought, there's no way that I can go forward. There's no way that I can survive this. And not suicidally, but you think, I wish that I could just cease to exist. Make this all go away. I've been there. In the Book of Mormon, we read that now these ordinances were given that thereby the people might look forward to the Son of God, that they might enter into the rest of the Lord. And again, I used to think it was this thing that happened in the future. But I think that there's a second meaning that this experience of the stroke taught me that is more instructive and more meaningful now. And that is the perfect assurance that comes from knowing the end from the beginning. I think that's what it means to enter into the rest of the Lord. In my case, I didn't get a full play-by-play. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but I knew how it was going to end. Imagine homecoming this weekend. We knew right now who was going to win the football game. It wouldn't matter how many touchdowns Boise made. It wouldn't matter how many bad calls, because we would know we were going to win. Everything was going to be okay. Now, that doesn't mean that hard tackles are not going to hurt. And it doesn't mean that we should needlessly just press on bruises over and over again. But what it does mean is that none of that really matters when we know that we're on the winning team. And I think that this concept puts what is perhaps one of the most recognizable or memorable verses in LDS Scripture in a new light. In Nephi we read, I will go and do the things which the Lord hath commanded. And as a young kid, I used to always put the emphasis on I will go and do. Because I thought that was the powerful part. That was the part to be proud of. But I've come to learn that I think the most important part of this is that Nephi knew the things which the Lord had commanded him. And that was the secret to his faith. That was why he could fail and keep getting up and keep trying, right? We know that the first time he tried using logic and reasoning power. The second time he tried using money and purchasing power. But what he had to learn is that none of those were the currencies for learning the mind and the will of the Lord. He had to learn that the comfort and the security that comes by knowing the Lord's will is a spiritual process. And that is why he was able to go forward in faith, not knowing beforehand the things which he was supposed to do. Story 2, for plan by principles. So I'm now in medical school. I've gotten past the stroke. I'm approaching graduation. And at this point in time, we were talking earlier, Texas schools are pretty inexpensive. It's wonderful. But I still had, just from medical school and my business degree, somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 worth of debt. And I got married over the course of this time, and my wife tells me afterwards, she says, I always knew that I was going to marry a doctor. I was her mark, I guess. And so here I am, and I've had this experience with the stroke, and it's made me rethink, how do I help people be better? I could go in a one-on-one patient-to-provider sort of encounter. I could do a lot of good. But there's also a macro approach here of how, rather than laying hands on somebody to heal them, can I put devices on people to heal them and give them the information of what their body's trying to tell them that maybe they don't already know. And so I go to my wife and I say, look, I think that we should take a different path. And along the way, I've been doing a lot of work kind of building this. It wasn't the first time we had talked about it, but here's what happens, is that if you've ever been through or seen everybody go through or familiar with the process, there's something called the National Residency Match Program, which is basically this not-for-profit group that sits in between all medical school applicants and all residency programs. And all of the programs are required to fill all of their spots through the NRMP. And that's because there's a lot of applicants, there's a small number of spots, and it would just create chaos if people were going kind of different ways. And on this applicant side, it also means that once you get in, you are legally bound to go there. You can't say, hey, I'm good later, because otherwise there's going to be important gaps in care at these programs. And so November of 2012, I'm about to go through this match program. I did all my interviews, I did all my way rotations, I've gotten all my letters of recommendation, filled out the applications and all that. But come November, we're still probably 3 to 4 months away from raising our first financing for this startup that I was interested in.